Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Abimelech narrative that's found in Judges chapter 9. In our story of Judges, we start off with a prologue in two parts, and then the very short Othniel narrative. You probably don't even remember him, fights the Philistines. Then Ehud, the social outcast, the left-handed man who leads Israel against oppressors from the east side of the Jordan River, the Ammonites. The Deborah and Barak narrative, where a woman slays the enemy, little Jael slays Sisera with a blow to the head. And finally, last time, the Gideon story, the valiant warrior who was, to be fair, just a bit afraid. And now we come to Abimelech, and again we're going to see a common theme where a woman slays the enemy, and Abimelech will be the enemy. He'll be killed with a blow to the head at the hands of a woman. Coming up next will be the Jotham narrative, another social outcast, the Samson story, and finally an epilogue in two parts. So bear with us as we continue through the book of Judges. Now, Judges chapter 8 and verse 30, from last time, Gideon had 70 sons, because they're going to play a part in this, who were his direct descendants, for he had many wives. But then his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. And we remarked last time on the name. Abimelech means my father the king. Remember, Gideon had said, I won't be king, but then he names his son my father the king. And that's just sort of odd, and that's going to be a portend of bad things to take place in this chapter. It came about, verse 33, it came about as soon as Gideon was dead that the sons of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal Berith, we'll see that name again, their god. And thus the sons of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the household of Jerubbaal, that is nicknamed for Gideon, in accordance with all the good that he had done to Israel. And so now we begin in chapter 9 and verse 1. Abimelech will be the key figure in this, and he won't be a hero. He'll be the anti-hero. Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, that's another name for Gideon, went to Shechem, to his mother's relatives, his mother was from Shechem, and spoke to them and to the whole clan of the household of his mother's father. And here's what he says. Verse 2, Speak now in the hearing of all the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that 70 men, all the sons of Jerubbaal, the sons of Gideon, rule over you, or that one man rule over you? What would you rather have, 70 leaders, like a tribal council, or do you want one man? Also remember that I'm your bone and your flesh. In other words, I'm from your town, so you ought to vote for me instead. Apparently he's making campaign promises, chapter 9, verse 3, and his mother's relatives all spoke these words on his behalf in the hearing of all the leaders of Shechem, and they were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our relative, be careful for what you wish. You might actually get it. Chapter 9, verse 4, they gave him 70 pieces of silver. Wait a second. They had appointed him so that they wouldn't have to be bowing down, so they would have to be dealing with 70 sons of Jerubbaal, and now they pay him, instead of a silver token to each, they pay him 70 pieces of silver from the house of Baal Berith. Whoop, there's that place again. Remember that they had played the harlot with the Baals and made the Baal Berith their god. That was back in chapter 8, verse 33. And now they take from that silver and they pay off Abimelech, and not only Abimelech, but hired worthless and reckless fellows, sons of Baal, and they followed him. Chapter 9, verse 5, Then he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone, but one escaped. Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. And so there's these mass executions as Abimelech acts very kingly. Now we think kingly is noble. No, kingly is ruthless. He is acting like a king. He's eliminating all competition. Chapter 9, verse 6, And all the men of Shechem and all Beth Millo assembled together, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar which was in Shechem. And you think that's going to be the end of the story. It's not. And so they make him king by the oak of the pillar, which is at Shechem. Now that's a place that we've read about before, back in Genesis chapter 12, verse 6, where Abram first comes to the land. He came as far as the site to the oak that's in Moreh. It sounds like it might be a similar place. The oak was a place that was noticeable. It was a what do you call it? It was a landmark. Likewise, Genesis chapter 35, verse 4, where Jacob had taken all the foreign gods that they had and the rings as he comes back into the land, and he had buried them under the oak which was near Shechem. So this might be the same oak, sort of you could call it the idol worshippers' oak. And he had buried them. He hadn't destroyed them. He had just buried them, sort of put them away for a rainy day. Well, now we see Jotham, that youngest son who had escaped, and when they told Jotham, he went and stood on the top of Mount Gerizim. There's two mountains that overlook Shechem, and this is one of them, and lifted his voice and called out. Thus he said to them, "Listen to me, O men of Shechem, that God may listen to you." Verse 8, and he tells a parable. And in the parable, once the trees went forth to anoint a king over them. You can sort of see the parallels of the parallel. And the trees say, "Reign over us," but the olive tree said to them, "Am I going to stop being an olive tree? Shall I leave the fatness with which God and men are honored and go to wave over the trees? I don't want to be king. Who would want to be king?" And so, verse 10, the trees said to the fig tree, "You come and reign over us." But the fig tree said to them, "Am I going to stop, leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go to wave over the trees? What's the big deal about that? Why would I want to possibly do that?" Verse 12, the tree said to the vine, "You come reign over us." Notice they're starting with the best and they're moving downhill. But the vine said to them, "Shall I leave my new wine, which cheers God and men, and go to wave over the trees? I wasn't made for that." And so finally, verse 14, all the trees said to the bramble, the weeds, "You come and reign over us." And the bramble said, "Sure. If in truth you are anointing me as king over you, come and take refuge in my shade." Wait a minute, brambles don't have shade. Well, we're going to pretend that they do. We're going to act kingly, and they're going to sort of lift me up and take refuge in my shade. But if not, may fire come out from bramble and consume those cedars of Lebanon. It's a strange story showing the strangeness of wanting a king when you don't need a king. And so you'd had the vine and the fig tree and the olive tree all had rejected, but the bramble said, "Sure, you can come down to my level." And that's exactly what the Israelites had done, the people of Shechem have done, by making Abimelech their king. And so he says, chapter 9, verse 19, "If then you have dealt in truth and integrity with Jerubbaal and his house this day, rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you." If you did the right thing, then have at it. Have fun. But, verse 20, "But if not, let fire come out from Abimelech," the same curse that the weed makes, he makes upon those who follow Abimelech. "Let fire come out from Abimelech and consume the men of Shechem and Beth Millo, and let fire come out from the men of Shechem and from Beth Millo and consume Abimelech." In other words, may you just go out and destroy each other. That's the curse on which he puts them. You know, one of the things that I remark about, and I'm not against democratic republics or democracy, but one thing in a democracy, you sort of get the leaders you deserve. You elect them. Be careful who you elect. Be careful for what you wish. You just might get it. Well, Jotham escaped, and that's the last we're going to see of him, and fled and went to Beer, the place of the well, and remained there because of Abimelech, his brother. He leaves town, and that's the last we're going to hear of him. But it won't be the last we hear of Abimelech. Indeed, we read, verse 22, that Abimelech ruled over Israel for 3 years, and everything seems to go well. It reminds me of what we read in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 11, "Because sentence against an evil deed is not executed quickly, therefore the hearts of the sons of men among them are given fully to do evil." Sometimes when we see bad things happen, and people seem, at least for the time, to get away with it, we think, what's going on with that? Well, Justice doesn't always come speedily, but it eventually does come. And so, verse 23, then God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. Notice God is the one who sets this up, this bad blood between the two, and the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech so that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might come, and their blood might be laid on Abimelech, their brother, who killed them, and on the men of Shechem, who strengthened his hand to kill his brothers. They're going to get each other, which is exactly what they deserve. Verse 25, the men of Shechem sent men in ambush against him on the tops of the mountains, and they robbed all who might pass by them along the road. And it was told to Abimelech, things are out of control. Israel is becoming a very dangerous place to live. And Abimelech, the king, is told, look, your kingdom is just sort of out of control. People are robbing people. And in the middle of that, we see another individual. He'll be short-lived, but his name is Gaal. Gaal, the son of Ebed, came with his relatives. Now, Gaal, we know him because of his name. Gaal means to hate, and haters are going to hate. And so he crossed over into Shechem, and the men of Shechem put their trust in him, and Gaal becomes the new hero on the block, sort of replacing Abimelech, or at least in his own mind. And what's more, the men of Shechem go along with him, and they put their trust in him. They're going to put their trust in all sorts of things besides God. And notice they went out into the field, and they gathered the grapes of their vineyards, and they trod them and held a festival, and they went into the house of their God, and ate and drank, and they cursed Abimelech. And Gaal is particularly verbose in his cursing of Abimelech. He says, that old Abimelech, if he were here, I'd give him a piece of my mind. If he were here, I'd give him a good thrashing. And so Gaal curses Abimelech, and wouldn't you know it, there's one of Abimelech's friends that's there that gets word of this back to Abimelech, and he's quick to respond, and so he hears about it, and now he comes, and in a surprise attack, he waits for people to be not expecting it, and his people come down from the hills, and they attack, and they kill Gaal, and the people of Shechem figure, well, that's the end of the matter. Gaal cursed him, and then Abimelech, came and killed Gaal, and we can sort of go back to business as usual, or so they think. And instead, verse 42, it came about the next day that the people went out to the field, and it was told to Abimelech, so he took his people and divided them into 3 companies and lay in wait in the field, and he looked and saw the people coming out of the field, and he rose against them and slew them. A bunch more people get killed. This fickle group from Shechem are getting their comeuppance. Verse 44, then Abimelech and the company who was with him dashed forward and stood in the entrance of the city gate. City gate's a big wide area. You're just seeing a picture of a little portion of a gate right here. And they stood in the entrance of the city gate, and 2 other companies then dashed against all who were in the field and slew them, and they're rounding up any stragglers. Verse 45, Abimelech fought against the city all that day, and he captured the city and killed the people who were in it, and he razed the city and sowed it with salt. And Shechem comes to an end, at least for the time being. Verse 46, when all the leaders of the tower of Shechem heard of it, they entered the inner chamber of the temple of El-Berith, same God, the God of the covenant that they've been worshiping, not the God of Israel. And verse 47, it was told Abimelech that all the leaders of the tower of Shechem were gathered together, and so he goes to take them out. Verse 48, so Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, he and all the people who were with him, and Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut down a branch from the trees and lifted it and laid it on his shoulder. And then he said to the people who were with him, what you've seen me do, hurry and do likewise. So everybody gets an axe, everybody gets a branch on the shoulder. Verse 49, all the people also cut down each one his branch and followed Abimelech and put them on the inner chamber and set the inner chamber on fire over those inside, so that all the men of the tower of Shechem also died, about 1,000 men and women. That's a big slaughter. And Abimelech is acting very kingly. He's taking retribution on anybody who said anything about him. And so Abimelech, he's attacked and burned the city of Shechem and its tower. But next, the city of Thebes comes under his disdain, and now he seeks to attack that city. After all, he was able to sort of clean up and take whatever was nailed down from Shechem, and now he can increase his holdings by attacking still another city. Chapter 9, verse 50, then Abimelech went to Thebes, and he camped against Thebes and captured it. Verse 51, but there was a strong tower in the center of the city, another tower. We've already handled that sort of thing before. And all the men and all the leaders of the city fled there and shut themselves, and they went up on the roof of the tower. And Abimelech knows how to handle that. He's already done that, been there, done that. Verse 52, so Abimelech came to the tower and fought against it and approached the entrance of the tower to burn it with fire, just like he did in the previous occasion. Verse 53, but a certain woman drew an upper millstone. Upper millstone is like a millstone you can carry in your hand. It's, it's heavy, but it's not overly heavily. And she throws this rock, this millstone, and it lands on Abimelech's head, crushing his skull. Verse 54, and he is hurt badly, and he called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, because you didn't carry your own armor, your own shield. Shields were really, really big in that day. And so his shield carrier, his armor bearer, and said to him, draw your sword and kill me, so that it will not be said of me that a woman slew him. Because he knows he's going to die, but he doesn't want that bad stain upon his name. And so the young man pierced him through, and he died. And you know what? We still say, to this day, 3,000 years later, a woman killed him. Verse 55, when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, each departed to his home, and thus ends the story. Verse 56, thus God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father in killing his 70 brothers. Also God returned all the wickedness of the men of Shechem on their heads, and the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal, came upon them. And so the story comes to a conclusion. But we ought to remember this in light of the bigger picture. You see, in the days of Sisera, back in the Deborah story, we had read about a enemy of God's people who was killed. Little Gaal took a tent peg and killed Sisera. Now it's Abimelech who is killed again by a woman. This time a millstone hits him on the head. Both times the enemy of God's people is killed with a blow to the head. It's a reminder of a promise back in Genesis chapter 3 of how the seed of the woman would deal treacherously, the seed of the woman would strike the enemy of God's people with a blow to the head. And we see that in the person of Jesus, who is the ultimate seed of the woman, who has dealt Satan a blow, a mortal blow, by notice through his own death, burial, but then through his resurrection. He conquered death. And we can enter into that eternal life.